So now Jean has done her research, and she's published it and shared it with her friends and such. And she wants to figure out what she's going to do next. So policy and funding starts coming into play, and so you may not think that that is necessarily cyber infrastructure, and maybe it isn't, but it is equally important on making the whole picture work. So in policy and funding, you have the federal agencies, the campuses, resource providers, and all trying to figure out how to make the system work. So next slide. Now we have a picture of what all the various cyber infrastructure functions are and what the resources are, but there's still this one thing that's missing. Next slide. How do all these parts work together? And to do that, you need the network. So the network connects all these parts and allows you to create a system that all the parts can interact. So a lot of ways you don't want to think about the network much, and indeed you probably shouldn't have to, but it's an important part that is there that makes it all work over this distributed area. So next slide. We talked a little bit about the parts and pieces, but there's also a number of people that are involved. So looking at more bubbles, you start looking at who is involved. Well, you've got the researchers, you've got Jane, you've got her grad students, you've got the staff that help out. You've got the campus IT that's helping provide some of the resources. You've got the people that are providing the security infrastructure, the network infrastructure. You've got the supercomputer sites, you've got grid organizations, you've got collection organizations. One thing that I think people forget a lot about is that the libraries are very involved with cyber infrastructure. It used to be that you'd publish your paper, they would go and put it in the library. But now that you're having all this data that's being collected and such, how is that being archived? How do you publish that? And librarians can help out on that. So I encourage you to, as you're starting your research project and starting to think about your data, go talk to the librarians and talk about where is it going after you're done with it. Also, an issue we're starting to see is a lot of disciplines are starting to want to share data. And a lot of times what I've seen is where they'll define their own data formats and such when they start, but then when they want to share it with somebody else, you end up with some problems. So librarians can help out with that as well. So you've got also the discipline groups that you work with, share research with, and then the policy and leadership and funding. So next slide. So I focused a little bit on research a view of cyber infrastructure, but you could go and take those bubble diagrams and then change it around and look at it a little differently. So maybe it's not a researcher, maybe it's an instructor that's doing the work. Maybe it's not instrumentation you're dealing with, but maybe it's students that are out there. But a lot of the other factors still come into play. So you still need the security, the data storage, visualization, and all the help that goes on. So you can redraw these diagrams on your own scenario and figure out what are the parts you really need and who are the players that really need to be involved. So now I'd like to go into a few of the details on a couple of the components. So next slide. If we start looking at the network part, that's the part that I've been involved with mostly. You think about the network as an individual network, but one thing you need to understand is that it's not just one network. There's a lot of different providers that are interconnected that provide you with the network that you see. So if you look at the path going from your desktop or your laptop, how do you get to the resource at the other end? So it'll go across your campus network, it'll go across a regional network, national backbones, and then back down the other side to regional networks, campus networks, and to your resource. There's also tie-ins to international networks when you're going off to other countries. So with all these different players involved, it's not necessarily simple that it's going to work every time. So they end up having problems. And when you do have problems, all those players have to get involved. So who do you go to? Well, it's probably best you go and talk to your network, campus network folks, because they know who the other players are and can start coordinating things when you need new resources or when you need a problem fixed. Next slide. If you start looking at the computational resources, they're distributed as well. So you might start out with doing computation on your desktop, but then you want to move on to maybe more power and more capabilities. And there's a number of ways you can go with that. There could be shared campus clusters. There could be shared regional clusters to provide you with computation. There's national centers that you can use for computation. Then there's schedulers that allow you to use each of those. There might be private regional clusters or private clusters that are assigned to a particular discipline. So there's a number of ways that you can find computational resources. Next slide. So if you're looking at storage, you'll also find a similar case where storage might be located in a number of different locations. It might be in your lab. It might be campus-wide storage. Your discipline might have repositories that you want to put data into. There's national centers. There's also distributed storage. Some of the research is going on to allow your information to be stored at various locations around the country. And the distributed storage will look at the usage patterns and move data so it's close to the person that's using it. So, for example, if you start pulling up a data set from across the country, it might say, okay, this person is starting to work on this data set, and maybe we ought to move it closer to them. And so there's some experimental systems that are going on in that. And then the libraries and collections, as I mentioned before, are important because a lot of times that's where it'll be the final place where your data will reside. Next slide. So putting it all together, how do you make it work? Well, gateways, or sometimes called science gateways, is one way that disciplines are dealing with it. Also being referred to as hubs these days. So Hub Zero, NanoHub is a good example of systems that people have put together to make it easier to use resources. Common software makes it a little easier, so that if you have common software on multiple systems, when you switch systems, it's not so hard to start using that new system. Common data formats and schema are important, particularly if you start sharing between disciplines or within a discipline in different groups and projects. Then performance and monitoring tools. How do you actually know what's going on the CI system that you're using? If you're running into problems, how do you know where those problems are? And there's a lot more that needs to be done for pulling this all together. Next slide. So what I've noted is that in researchers, there's kind of two groups. There are those researchers that are willing to jump in, learn the technology, and create their own CI environment. So to date, a lot of the researchers that use CI have been forced into doing that. They become the experts, or they have some experts that are very close to them, they're grad students or some staff, to create their own CI environment. But there are a lot of researchers that want to focus on their discipline and don't want to have to become CI experts. And with the increasing spread of use of CI, that group needs some help. How can they get the resources they need? How can they learn to use the resources without necessarily having to spend all the time to become technology experts? So, but really all the researchers would like cyber infrastructure to be easier. Next slide. So is cyber infrastructure too hard? Should you really have to worry about the network or the computers or the storage? Wouldn't you rather just be able to use an application, do your research without having to worry about all that stuff? So I think those of us that are deal with the technology and creating the technology have a ways to go yet. So here again, this is where I want your input on what would make it easier for you. What are your what kind of things would you like to see that would allow you to use cyber infrastructure and focus on your discipline? Next slide. So one thing that we've seen coming up is the cloud. Everybody's starting to hear about cloud resources, and what is the cloud? Well, to me, it means somebody else is taking care of your technology for you, so that what you end up doing is having essentially an input-output device. A lot of times that ends up being your web browser, so that you can access those resources that are out elsewhere. So it sounds like a good solution. You know, it makes it easier for you to deal with the technology. Some of those are being provided by the commercial sectors, you know, like Amazon and Google and such. Or there's cloud resources that are starting to pop up now in the academic community. But some of the things you need to think about when you're looking at the cloud is, do you actually trust them? Can you rely on them? So, you know, you're no longer controlling your own hardware and devices. You're relying on these others. Do you have an alternative if it doesn't work out? Can you easily move it to another location or to another service? So those are things when you're looking at the cloud. Think about the future, and I think over time we'll start seeing more standards within the cloud that'll make it easier. But you know, you still want to make sure that you have migration paths and such. So next slide. So I'm going to ask you about problems you've come into on cyber infrastructure. But a couple of things that I've noted is that why advanced cyber infrastructure is not more widely used. Two things I've noted. One is every time you learn a new application, you have to learn a new interface. So that ends up being a barrier that if you have to learn something new every time, something completely new every time you want to use it, it becomes difficult. You think about, to go back to the car analogy, what if you got into a car and it didn't have a standard dashboard or pedals or steering wheel? You had to go and learn it every time. It'd be really hard. So what we need is more of the car analogy, where you hop into an application and you got a pretty good idea how to use it. The other issue is performance and reliability. It's inconsistent. A lot of times you go and try something and it doesn't quite work right, or it has problems, and a lot of researchers will go back and say, well, you know, this really isn't working out. I'm going to go back and use something that's a little easier or more reliable, or something I know. I mean, how many of you have used video conferencing and then you spend the first 10 minutes trying to make it work? A lot of researchers I know just say, well, we can just go back to the phone bridge. We know how to do that. So those are a couple of things that I noted. I want to hear about yours as well. I wrote a paper on why advanced networking isn't more widely used, and I got the reference on the bottom of the page there. So I'd be interested in your input on that as well, to see if that's what the reason is why things are hard. Next slide. So I have a vision of what cyber infrastructure can do for you. What I'd like to see is that computation and storage allow easy transition from the desktop to campus resources, regional centers, supercomputer centers, using the same software. A lot of times now when you do that transition, you have to learn a new interface. You have to sometimes recode your software. If you're using standard software, it's a little easier, but it's still not particularly easy to do those transitions. I'd like to see data repositories and formats and locations that allow easy sharing amongst interested disciplines. This would be the real digital library, so that when you are doing your research and say, I would really like to know about what's going on in this particular area because it seems to tie in, that the data is easy for you to pull in.